Hi, I'm Martha Moriarty, a member at First Universalist and a qualified administrator for the IDI. I am here to share the group results of our congregation, our assessment results from the IDI. So let's get started. So we're going to look at some slides kind of introducing the concepts around the Intercultural Development Inventory and some of the language we'll use. I'll also be talking about purpose. What's your purpose or what's your why? We're also then going to look at our group profile and we'll look at the data and some different aspects of that. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the recommendations that the IDI provides and information and how we're going to use that as a congregation. So my next slide is what's your why? And this is a short video about finding your purpose and the impact that your purpose can have. So I'm going to play that and then we'll come back and I have a few questions for you to stop and consider before you move on with the video.
How do I know? A lot of people, when they think of the phrase, how do I know, they always want to put the what behind it. How do I know what I'm supposed to do? The question that you really should ask is, how do I know why I'm here? Because when you know your why, your what becomes more clear and more impactful. If you know, like for instance, people know that I do comedy, but that's what I do. My why is to inspire people to walk in purpose. So I can do comedy, I can write books, I can be in a movie, because all of it is motivated by my why. In fact, I have a new web series out called Michael Jr. Break Time. We probably just did the 6th episode. It's on YouTube. So every single Wednesday at 3 o'clock, we drop a new episode on YouTube of Michael Jr. Break Time. What it is it's me. I travel around the country and I do stand-up comedy, in case you didn't know. And in the middle of my comedy set sometime, I'll stop and just talk to my audience. And we've been filming this, and it's pretty cool. So we're in Winston-Salem. I'm going to show you a clip from Winston-Salem. And I'm just talking to this guy in the audience, and he tells me that he's a musical instructor at a school. So I was like, all right, you're a musical instructor. Can you sing? Let me hear you sing a song. So this is what happened at the last episode of Michael Jr.'s Break Time. Check it. So you're a musical director?
Yes, sir.
All right, so let me get a couple bars of like Amazing Grace. Can you do the first part of that? Go ahead.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
Wow. That bro could sing. You know what I'm saying? All right. Now, what you give me the version is if your uncle just got out of jail, you got shot in the back when you was a kid. I'm just saying, let me see the hood version real quick. If you know which version I'm talking about, just see if that exists. Let me see what you got.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Now I'm found, but blind, but now I see.
Okay. Here's what I want you to catch. The first time I asked him to sing, he knew what he was doing. The second time, he knew why he was doing it. When you know your why, your what becomes more impactful because you're walking towards or in your purpose.
All right. So
How do I?
I really like that video because your why will always help you in this work when we're talking about culture and inclusion and creating a community that's inclusive. So I want you to consider, what is your why? What is your purpose? And first, think about, what's your reaction to this video? When you think about First Universalists in our faith community, what's your why? Why do you come? Why do you care about First Universalists and want to be part of the community? And then when you think about why, think about your engagement in diversity, culture, inclusion, race, equity, and justice at First Universalist. Why is that important work that we do? And why do we want to create a beloved community at our church? So take some time, pause the video, and think about these things. Because again, if you understand your purpose and your why, moving down this path is going to be easier. So I'm going to give some definitions about culture and inclusion and equity, all of those words that we use. So we all have some shared meaning around this language. So what is culture? Culture is patterns of shared basic assumptions and beliefs that helps us approach challenges and problems that are learned and taught by members in that community, either implicitly or explicitly, as the way of doing things, the way that we believe in things. And I love this quote, it's how we do things around here. That's culture. And we're implicitly or explicitly taught these things by our parents, by people in the community. When you show up somewhere, people share it in many kinds of ways through modeling and behavior or through sharing through language. And culture is really what's accepted in a group, what's familiar in a group, how we do things. And we talked about that during the church service when the IDI was brought up. The IDI, the Intercultural Development Inventory, also has a definition of culture not too far away from what I just shared about patterns. But they think about culture as a worldview related to participation in a group. So that could be as big as national, it could be racial, it could be ethnic boundaries, but it also could just represent, affiliations like region or religion, gender, sexual orientation, ability, socioeconomic status. Culture could be kind of small, like small groups, or it could be really large, like, a nation. And in the IDI, when they talk about our culture or my culture, they're talking about groups you feel like you belong to. So when I think about my culture, I have groups that I feel like I belong to. First Universalist would be one of those groups. Other cultures would be groups that people from different cultures or groups that you don't feel you belong to, I would consider other cultures. So I don't really know much about them, the way they behave, or their values or beliefs. A few other definitions, just so we're all on the same page. Diversity, we're going to use that term in terms of the broad array of differences in identity or perspective, skill, or style. So diversity can be made up of people with all kinds of differences, or things that have all kinds of differences are a diversity of things. Culture, we've talked about, this is patterns of like values and beliefs and behaviors learned from your group. The idea of intercultural competence is going to come up. This is the capability to shift cultural perspective in appropriate ways that you're adapting to cultural differences and commonalities that show up. And we're going to talk about that in more depth. Inclusion is the state of a workplace or a community or an organization where everyone feels welcome, accepted, and engaged. And creating an inclusive community is, somewhere where people with all kinds of differences can still show up, be their authentic selves, and feel welcome, accepted, and engaged. And then equity, we're going to be specific about. Equity is policies and practices that are just transparent and consistent. And so creating equitable workplaces or equitable organizations means that you have policies and practices that are consistent, and transparent and, create hopefully inclusive environments. So a core concept of the IDI is around this idea of intercultural competence. And we think that it takes both cultural self-understanding as well as cultural other understanding. So, do you understand your own culture as well as other cultures? And this ability or capability to shift perspective and behavior based on commonalities and differences of other cultures as well as your own, and really seeing the greater complexity of culture is intercultural competence. So, someone who's interculturally competent understands the complexity of culture, sees their own culture as well as others, and has an ability to shift their perspective as well as their behavior potentially to be more effective in a given situation. So I'm going to give a few examples of cultural frameworks. One of the assignments typically for somebody who's taken the IDI after they get the results is to start thinking about culture. And understanding cultural frameworks oftentimes helps people understand culture in greater ways. So some of this might be new to folks. It might be, you might already have seen some of these frameworks. The tourist framework of culture is this idea of what you see when you're a tourist. So culture is, seen through what people wear, the art they create, their food, the language, architecture around them, maybe what they celebrate. It really is what you see and experience in, kind of a tourist setting. Another framework, though, I really like is the iceberg concept of culture. And the surface level of culture, or this portion above the waterline, is kind of what we think of that tourist definition or framework of culture. It's what you see and experience: food, dress, music, art, etc. And what I like about this is they also talk about the emotional level that people experience. And so, again, everything above the waterline is emotionally relatively low kind of emotional level experience for people. They don't feel threatened by it. What you see is not a threatening way to understand culture. But as you get into these deeper levels of culture underneath the waterline, the iceberg, of course, gets bigger and bigger, and the emotional level for people in their experience is often greater intensity. So, this first level underneath the waterline are unspoken rules of culture. It could be, personal space, rules of conduct, the facial expressions people have, how they handle emotions, how they understand beauty in a culture. So, again, a pretty high level of emotion for some of those, but there are just unspoken rules that people have around what those meanings are. What is the meaning of beauty in a culture? The unconscious rules, though, are things that people don't even realize about their own culture. And these are really below the sea level. And they're also intensely emotional for people. It's things like the concept of self, or the concept of past and future, or definitions of obscenities, how problems are solved, the roles that either age or gender or class or occupation might have in a culture. And to me, that often means who has power in a culture. And these are not at all written. They're not even spoken about. They're really unconscious rules that many cultures have around things. All cultures, honestly, have around things. So when you kind of think about your own culture, what are some of those deep levels, the unspoken rules and the unconscious rules that maybe you carry in your culture and are not even aware of? Another framework is the onion. I like this one because the inside of the onion is really those ideas that a culture carries, the beliefs, values, and assumptions that drive the culture. It's really the essence of the culture. Behaviors are the next level of the onion, outside of that inner, and that's kind of how people behave. How they greet one another, how they experience conflict or with each other, maybe relationships, those definitions of relationships, what traditions or rituals they may have. And then the products on the outside of the onion is what you see. So again, going back to, it could be art or music or food or language or buildings, or architecture, clothing, etc. So that's what you see on the outside. But really the inside of the onion, that strongest layer of the onion, are those core values and beliefs that a culture will hold. So I encourage you to go out and, discover more cultural frameworks, understand your culture in a new way. So we're going to look at the Intercultural Development Inventory now. Um, as I explained in our church service a few weeks ago, the Intercultural Development Continuum is what this assessment provides is the results of where you are as an individual across the continuum. And our group results are an aggregate of our congregation. So I'll give a brief overview of this continuum, and then we're going to look at the results. So on the far left side, the monocultural mindset includes denial and polarization. And the monocultural mindset really centers their own cultural experience as the lens they're viewing other cultures through. So in denial, folks in denial oftentimes miss differences. They really only understand their own culture, but really not in a deep way. They're not very aware of those deep levels of culture in that iceberg example. But they understand that they have ways of being and doing, and they're really missing that others might have ways of being and doing that are different. In polarization, folks again are centering their own lens of culture and they're judging differences. So they may be judging their own culture, and that could be kind of based on shame about, what maybe their own culture has done, and really uplifting other cultures, thinking that they're doing things the right way. Or it could be judging other cultures, thinking their culture does everything the correct way and other cultures don't do it the correct way. And so they're judging other cultures. Either way, really it's about judging differences that come up. In minimization, that's a transitionary period along this continuum. And folks in minimization really de-emphasize difference and they uplift commonalities. The majority of the population is typically in minimization. And minimization usually stays away, folks in that orientation usually stay away from bias and stereotypes. But the issue that often comes to play is they don't really see their own culture in their behaviors and actions. And so finding commonalities with others is a very comfortable way of being in the world, and you get along with others. But really seeing the deep differences often does not kind of come into their experience. And so de-emphasizing difference is a comfortable way of moving through the world. And so folks in dominant culture oftentimes are not so aware that their own culture, those core values and beliefs and behaviors, because they're like a fish in water and they don't really see the dominant culture around them because they're part of it. We also, though, have folks in non-dominant culture who experience minimization too. And it's usually a strategy for anybody who's not part of the dominant culture to navigate through the dominant culture. And so we usually say they're going along to get along. They're really just using it as a strategy to navigate a culture that don't feel like they're part of. All right. The other side of the continuum is the intercultural mindset. So again, this is more of a global mindset. Folks in these two acceptance and adaptation orientations are not necessarily centering their own cultural experience. Acceptance really deeply understands culture and sees the complexity of culture. They really understand differences that cultures have. They understand their own culture as well as others. But folks in acceptance often don't know what to do. So the idea of action or being able to bridge difference or mediate situations where a lot of conflict or differences come up, they're going to kind of be frozen and not really know exactly what to do. And then in adaptation, those are folks with higher intercultural competency. They're able to see culture and the deep levels, their own and others. They're honestly able to kind of step into and understand another culture and bridge differences that come up. I'm going to skip the video and I'm going to send a link to this video with this video as well. All right, so we're going to look at our group profile results and discuss what that means for our congregation. So our perceived orientation score, this is in acceptance. What is perceived orientation? Perceived orientation is where we believe we are along that intercultural development continuum that I just showed you. So as a congregation, the assessment can measure where we think we are. And so we believe we're in acceptance as an aggregate group. Perceived orientation, I like to think of as our aspiration. We believe we're in this space and acting in acceptance. And acceptance, again, is that deep comprehension of culture, your own and others, and appreciating culture, but not really often knowing what to do in a given situation. I recently had a mentor say that perceived orientation we can often think of as our intent. So in a situation, our intent is to say it this way, but sometimes people understand it differently, right? Because we may not have the same shared meaning of what we have said or the language that we've used. So think of perceived as our intent. Um, our developmental orientation is where we will often operate in real life. And so our developmental orientation as a congregation, the aggregate score is in minimization. Again, minimization is a transitionary period. It is de-emphasizing difference, really uplifting commonalities. And it could be because you're part of dominant culture, just not really seeing the deep levels of culture around you or being aware of them because everyone's like you. Or it could be because you're navigating culture because you're not part of the dominant culture. So again, developmental orientation is where we likely in a given situation will behave and operate on a day-to-day basis. Again, going back to that idea is perceived orientation is our intent, we could think of developmental orientation as our impact. So if our intent was to say one thing, but boy, it landed differently than what we thought it would, our impact was different, right? So I hope that's helpful. Again, minimization, the majority of people who assess and take the IDI fall into minimization, 85% typically. But our scores, again, in aggregate, we have people across the continuum who have different scores, but this is the aggregate score. So we have a gap between our perceived orientation and our development orientation. It's about a 20-point gap, 21 points. That orientation gap is meaningful. And I'll share my screen. We've overestimated our intercultural competence. And what I mean by meaningful is that we may not think that the results are accurate. Again, our intent is different from our impact. So the way we think people understand us may not be the way it actually lands with them. I think the other thing that is interesting about overestimating orientation is that research really indicates that people think they do better or are more effective than they actually are. And in this case, we probably think we're more effective in the way that we communicate and behave around others than we actually are in making sure they understand what we're saying or doing. So our orientation gap is around 20 points. The range of orientations in our group. So this chart shows that we have a wide variety of people across the continuum in our congregation. But about 60% of our congregation has a developmental orientation in minimization. So that's the majority of people in our congregation are in minimization. So when you get your individual results, you could be in any one of the 5 orientations, but the majority of you are in minimization. We do have, though, a group in acceptance and, almost 10% or 9% in both adaptation and polarization. So we have a wide range of orientations and a very small group in denial, but a wide range of orientations in our congregation. And what that means for our organization as we work together to create a beloved community at First Universalist is we may have a hard time finding consensus with a wide range of orientations. The group does not necessarily have shared meaning around everything. And the group likely has both a monocultural mindset, so some folks in denial and polarization, as well as intercultural mindset, so folks in acceptance and adaptation. And, without some targeted intercultural competence development, we will find it difficult to achieve a shared vision and focus or meeting our goals and objectives of creating a culturally diverse environment or an inclusive community, or what we, have written in our visionary goals, a beloved community. So keep that in mind as we work together. It will be difficult to find consensus in creating policies, procedures, and practices to move our organization forward as a beloved community. I did want to talk a little bit more about our perceived orientation and our developmental orientation. So, the strength of our perceived orientation is in acceptance is that we have a really positive attitude and willingness to understand and engage in cultural differences across many kinds of groups. So, a really great, attitude about it. But really, the opportunity to develop as a group or a community is to understand more deeply culture, our own culture, and those frameworks of culture. And I, again, presented a couple frameworks like the iceberg or the onion or the tourist framework, but culture comes in many different ways, forms, and shapes. And those are some cultural general frameworks, but there are also cultural specific frameworks. But our goal is really to understand culture in a deeper way. Our acceptance, again, is our perceived orientation. So, again, acceptance has a lot of strengths. We're curious about cultural differences. We acknowledge that context is relevant. So, it depends on how you adapt. Context matters. Folks in acceptance really seek experiences and knowledge around culture. They want to learn more about different cultures. They treat their own experience in cultural terms, so they understand their own culture and understand that their experience is through their cultural experience and lens. But again, folks in acceptance are unsure how to appropriately adapt to cultural differences. And there's also a lot of unwillingness to apply ethical principles and values across cultures. So, because of that unsurety about what to do in a given situation, there's an unwillingness to apply moral and ethical values, basically. So, again, a deep cultural self-understanding and then a cultural other understanding is the key development for acceptance. So again, that's our perceived orientation. But our developmental orientation, how we operate in the world, is minimization. And so in any given situation, minimization will probably be the way that we all behave. And that group, again, has success interacting with people from many different cultures. But we use that kind of strategy of focusing on commonalities as our way to do this work. And so de-emphasizing difference can really mask the importance of differences. And the group may struggle to bridge when diversity comes into play and differences come together because groups in minimization often don't deeply understand the deeper levels of difference and those deeper levels of culture on that iceberg and how those differences are emotionally connected to groups and how they behave. So, the developmental opportunity for minimization is really to understand your own cultural influences, your own cultural beliefs, values, and practices, and then start to begin learning more about cultural general and cultural specific frameworks. So, honestly, the developmental opportunity for both acceptance and minimization is to understand your own culture better and then start to begin understanding other cultures to make sense of cultural differences. A little bit more about minimization from a dominant culture perspective. Minimization minimizes the role and significance of differences. And folks in minimization, again, like I said, they don't want to stereotype people. They don't want to denigrate other cultures. They've moved beyond the feeling that differences are a threat, but they really see that deep down we're all the same. And they view others through their own cultural lens. So their own experience is really how they see everyone else. It's a very comfortable approach to seeing differences. And folks in minimization are also very tolerant. So again, some great strengths. But the key development again is building deeper cultural self-awareness and understanding to then begin to understand cultural differences. For those in non-dominant culture, and you can really be in both dominant and non-dominant culture, depending on the situation, and experience minimization in each of these ways. But for folks in non-dominant culture, really, they minimize the role and significance of difference as a strategy to be part of that dominant cultural group. They focus on the team. They want to be equal contributors and, on board. They really don't want to stand out is part of the strategy. Um, and they know that the context was not developed for them and their cultural identities in mind. So they recognize that dominant culture was not developed around their cultural differences. And so the challenge really is to navigate the cues and signals that the individual does not matter, does not fit in, won't do well based on difference, so that they don't stand out. But what a huge challenge is for folks in non-dominant culture is they're often picking and choosing the important aspects of their own cultural identity, and they leave that part at the door so that they can get along with the dominant culture. And I think that's the issue with, non-dominant minimization and just having a community in minimization is who is not being included, what parts of their identity, so that dominant culture can be comfortable. So the key development is, again, building cultural self-awareness and understanding cultural identity and the importance and how it matters and how, again, that context, when to maneuver the context and when to exit the door, because identity and how important that is to somebody's health. So um, let's keep going. So what to do next? So we're in minimization as a group developmentally. We're going to navigate through acceptance to adaptation is the goal. And I really like this quote because this is really a key is commonality can never be assumed. It's either discovered, negotiated, or created. We can't make assumptions that we all have shared meaning around things, our behaviors or the words we use or how we act. Shared meaning really needs to be discovered, negotiated, and created. And so how this impacts our group and our congregation. There's probably a sense that we feel that we're on the right track. We, adopted visionary goals of creating a beloved community. And so we kind of think, yeah, we're moving forward. But what we're probably not doing is attending as deeply as needed to those cultural differences and integrating those differences into solutions generated. And so creating an inclusive environment means that differences are understood. Differences that make a difference, too, are especially understood and included. And so being able to attend to differences is a key skill that we need to develop. The level of intercultural competence also suggests that this group will be challenged to identify which cross-culturally adaptive policies and practices can guide common efforts across difference. So again, we will likely struggle, and this is also that mindset of acceptance or the orientation, is we likely will struggle to figure out what to do because we're not really sure. So, again, understanding where we are will help us to move forward and having that self-awareness. And I'm just going to give an example of policies across this continuum because I really think this helps people understand what does this mean, right? So an organization in denial, if we're using women's advancement as our example, and I got this from Kevin Carter, he's a qualified administrator as well. An organization in denial would say about women's advancement, well, policies and practices work for me, so it should work for women. Done. Because they don't really see the differences that women may have, right, in a workplace. In polarization, again, the key to polarization is judging differences. They would say, well, if women adapt to the system, they'll succeed in the system. So women have to change to adapt to what we're doing. So there's some judgment in that statement that women have to change, right, to our system. In organization and minimization would likely say, well, universal, consistent, and equally applied standards are key to women's advancement. So if we all had standards and understood them and they were consistent, women will be able to advance in our organization. Again, not attending to the differences, but finding commonalities through universal, consistent, equally applied standards. So, on the intercultural mindset, acceptance, again, thinking acceptance is understanding difference but not knowing what to do. They would be asking a question. Well, what work environment or behaviors foster or impede women's advancement? So they're asking the question, but not really knowing, but deeply understanding that women may have some differences. And so, what's not allowing women to advance is their question, but not knowing what to do. And then in adaptation, it would be we model behaviors and adopt policies, practices, and systems that advance women. So they recognize women may have differences in a workplace, and they recognize that we have to model behaviors and adopt policies so that our system will advance women. And we know organizations have done this. Example of an organization that made some changes in recent years is around breastfeeding. And so if a new mother has to travel for work, the company pays for her milk to be shipped back and takes care of it, and everything is ready for her. Again, making it so that she can do her job and advance in her job while still seeing that she may have differences. So, as we think about policies, practices, how we do things around here, and what would need to change to be an inclusive environment, I think that an example is really nice, and I like this one on women's advancement. So our next orientation, like I said, is acceptance and then adaptation. And to do that, what do we need to do? So this is our work as individuals, first and foremost. So I would say first, go and figure out your purpose, your why. Why are you here? Why do you want to be part of an organization or community that is trying to achieve beloved community? As a group, spending intentional time getting to know each other, focusing on relationship building, understanding bias, identifying strengths. This again helps us understand our own culture as well as other cultures, and building those authentic relationships is key. Developing some kind of learning community structure focused on exploring intersections of racial disparity, racial identity develop, faith-based culture, and equity will be key to helping us continue to move forward. Again, this is our individual work, but as a group, we can come together to talk about these things too and explore those intersections. And then developing specific objectives and goals for race, equity, culture, and competence development is also something that we'll be working on as a group. But key is focusing on your own development will help with group development. So my final thoughts, building an adaptive mindset requires shift. Really, intercultural competence is this ability to shift. And I want to kind of reframe something for you that you probably have heard. The golden rule is treat others the way you want to be treated. We learned this probably as very young people, but I want to shift that to the platinum rule. And if you've ever heard of that, that is do unto others the way they want to be treated. So it's thinking about others, not thinking about ourselves. So the golden rule we can think about is me-centered. The platinum rule is you-centered. So who are you working with? Who are you communicating with? Think about what they need or want. What are their cultural preferences, their cultural norms? And thinking about that rather than your own. So it really flips the perspective. And the platinum rule takes a little more work, honestly, because you're treating others the way they want to be treated. You're going to have to ask questions. You're going to have to observe, maybe research a little bit. It really takes more, I think, more work to listen and reflect, and then it takes some risks. And so it can be uncomfortable, but it's part of the growth process to understand how others want to be treated and to understand their culture. And changing the way that we see the world takes a lot of work. And this is, why is behavior so hard to change? Honestly, it's because our past affects our choices right now. All of our experience affects the way that we think about things, right? Our core identity also drives our behavior. And I would say this is also our culture. So our identity is often kind of mixed with our culture, and it really drives the way that we behave in the world. And so keep that in mind as you're working on your own intercultural development plan. If you also don't know your why or your purpose, you're going to have a hard time changing your behavior or changing the behavior in an organization, the way that we act around one another. So understanding our why will be key to this work. Walking the path of least resistance is always the easiest. So that, of course, is on the list. And then I think the last one about engaging in authentic communication is key. If we cannot allow people to show up authentically and communicate authentically, we're not going to be able to change the behavior in our organization. And most people feel some cognitive dissonance. Maybe you feel like, no, as a group or an individual, I'm farther along this continuum. I understand culture in deeper ways. Changing the way I think about things is going to be really hard. And so oftentimes you're going to feel that. Comforting lies are a lot easier than unpleasant truths, honestly. And I like this quote by Franz Fanon. Sometimes people hold a core belief that's very strong. When they are presented with evidence that works against the belief, the new evidence cannot be accepted. And this would create a feeling that's extremely uncomfortable, called cognitive dissonance. And because it's so important to protect our core beliefs, we rationalize, ignore, even deny anything that doesn't fit into those core beliefs. So it's a lot of work and you may feel uncomfortable. And you think your plan is going to be easy, but in reality, a lot comes up and diverts you from your plan, but there's still the goal at the end. So keep that in mind. So thank you so much for taking the IDI and being part of the group. And I really look forward to meeting with folks individually to talk about your results. When you meet with one of the qualified administrators who will be offering times to get your individual results, you're going to get your own report as well as an intercultural development plan. And that plan is homework for each and every one of you to do on your own. And I really hope that you take that and take advantage of it. It's a great tool for some development around your own intercultural competence. So feel free to reach out to me if you have questions. I'm happy to answer questions. And I look forward to meeting with you in the future. Thanks so much.